Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. Welcome, everyone. If you enjoy the show, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast listening platform and YouTube. You can now also check out the full video episode on X. Please also consider sharing your favorite episodes and leaving a review. If you do that and tag me or send me a screenshot, I will enter you in a monthly raffle for a free 30-minute consultation with me. For full episode details, including notes, timestamps, transcripts, and the show Patreon page, and other ways to support the show, please head over to my website at zachbitter.com. There you can find all my coaching services, including some new offerings for 2025. You can also sign up for my Substack newsletter, where I have been publishing my training journal weekly, as well as other topic-based posts. If you have any questions or feedback, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on my website or at hpopodcast@gmail.com. A big thanks to Element, Delta G Ketones, Curans, and Maui Nui Venison for supporting the podcast. A full description of how I use these products can be found at the end of the episode. Discounts, promotions, and details can also be found in the show notes and at the end of each episode. All right, folks, for this episode, I have a topic for you, and the topic today is going to be fit but unhealthy. So I wanted to cover this one because it's been around for a long time. This isn't anything new, but recently a story popped up on the internet that looked at a highly competitive, popular triathlete, Lionel Sanders, who dropped a YouTube video and basically said, hey, I've been following this hyper carbohydrate fueling strategy that's gotten more popular over the last few years, where we're seeing some of these professional endurance athletes sort of challenge the evidence in terms of how much carbohydrate can yield better performance. And now we're seeing targets of 150, sometimes even 180 grams per hour, both in training and racing efforts. And when you see that sort of stuff, there's always often All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today I've got a topic-based one for you, and this one is going to be on a topic that has sort of been back in the news. It's not something that's necessarily new to performance, health, and nutrition, but a recent story kind of popped it back up, which is this idea of fit but unhealthy. So, we've got like these pro athletes out there who on the surface look great, they look healthy, they look like there's nothing they could do different that would improve their health and longevity. But when we go on the inside and test, we find out, okay, maybe there's some problems here that, if aren't corrected, are going to result in some downstream issues for them later on in life. So I sort of just wanted to unpack that idea and share with you my thoughts on just like where the risks and where the decision making within that actually are worth exploring versus doing what oftentimes happens online, which is taking an anecdote and projecting it on an entire group of people because we've got this new flashy story to kind of base it off of. So for a little bit of background, the Lionel Sanders story was he's a very competitive, popular triathlete, and he's been doing this hyper carbohydrate strategy for his training and competitions. And he went in to check some health markers. I think he got like a blood draw and wore a continuous glucose monitor and found out that his markers were decent or good, but his fasting blood glucose was not. So I think both his CGM and the fasting blood glucose suggested that he is in the pre-diabetic range of blood glucose levels. And for him, that was concerning. He saw that and said, hey, I don't like where this is heading. If this continues, it's possible that I would develop type 2 diabetes and then give myself a whole lot of complications later in life that I don't want to deal with and I don't want my family to have to deal with. And he made some nutritional adjustments that I believe have helped kind of correct that scenario for him. And with that came all the expected sort of online rhetoric around, all right, is this a dangerous application that we should be discouraging against for the professional athletes like Lionel Sanders and, certainly your average endurance athlete out there who's sort of blending that lifestyle in with whatever else they have going on between careers and family and things like that. And then also people who are more optimistic maybe about this type of a fueling strategy, saying, hey, but look at this. Like, he was doing this wrong. This is an application issue, not a feature of this input. And, you just get a lot of back and forth with that sort of stuff. So I wanted to sort of cover the fit but unhealthy topic and maybe use that as a little bit of an example of how to kind of go around with this sort of stuff. So for the first thing with fit but unhealthy that I like to think about is when we look at athletes like Lionel Sanders, or even myself to a degree, where we're training 20, sometimes 30 hours per week preparing for these events that we're trying to optimize for performance. And the demands of a lifestyle like that, personally, I think mean you need to pay closer attention to your nutrition, not less attention. So by less attention, I mean sometimes the assumption is, oh, well, when I'm training 20, 30 hours per week, or when Lionel Sanders is out there, taking in 1,000 grams of carbohydrate per day, it's really a non-issue as to what it is. It's just get the fuel in, make sure you're not under eating so you can support training, more training, and faster recovery and things like that. And to some degree, that's true. You do want to make sure you're getting enough energy in to support training and allow yourself to recover and get more of it in, and over time stack more bricks and be ready for race day and perform at the highest level. But to think of it as it's as simple as just eat a bunch and you can get away with more because you've got this huge metabolic demand, is missing the point. Because I think when we're asking our body to perform at that level and we're asking ourselves to put in that work and recover from it quicker, we almost have to pay closer attention to nutrition, because if you don't, the margin of performance dip is just going to be a little more noticeable. So like if I was just sedentary and I wasn't paying close attention to my nutrition, or making a bunch of mistakes in my nutrition, I mean, I'd probably pay a price for that, but it wouldn't necessarily be something that would limit my performance to any large degree to be able to get through a sedentary lifestyle, at least in the short term. Whereas with something like performance at a professional level, it could. So like you could go out and say, I'm going to do this workout, and you doing it 98% as well as you could versus 100% could be something that's just maybe a little more obvious, and you start seeing those things pop up. And I think like paying attention to nutrition is a big component of making sure you're closer to 100% more often than not. So that's the way that I like to look at it. I think it's something where when you start adding more training to your lifestyle, more exercise to your lifestyle, you should pay even closer attention versus less attention, because you can quote unquote get away with more input in that scenario. I also think it's worth mentioning that it's probably going to be more difficult the further you get to the extremes. So if we take Lionel Sanders as an example of an extreme on the high carbohydrate side, or if we wanted to use the exact opposite of that, of a very low kind of ketogenic diet, I think when you start getting to those far ends of the extreme, you're also adding a layer of complexity in terms of how close you have to pay attention, because you could potentially be crowding out things that would be coming from the part that you're lowering to make room for the thing you're raising. So on the hyper high carb side of things, what are you missing out on by adding that much carbohydrate from both a micronutrient and a metabolic standpoint by the reduction in fat that's required to kind of fit and make room for that much carbohydrate? Same thing on the low carb ketogenic side of things. Like what micronutrients or metabolic things are you missing out on with a complete or nearly complete removal of carbohydrate to make room for that level of fat intake and things like that? So generally speaking, the further you get to the extremes, I think the even more close you need to pay to the attention of these things. So whether that's relevant to you or not, it's worth noting that that's just my general thought of the matter. I think when you increase training, when you put a higher premium on performance, you need to pay closer attention to nutrition. And then when you get further to the extremes of what you're doing for nutrition, you have to add a whole nother layer of thought and consideration with that sort of thing. And the risk and the potential error by not goes up when you're kind of doing those sort of things. So the next part of this that I want to kind of just talk about is like, we look at someone like Sanders or any professional athlete you can find that kind of had a rough end to their life because presumably their lifestyle to chase peak performance when they were younger had a cost at the back end of it. And it can be easy to sort of demonize professionalism, in this case, professional endurance athletes, and say, hey, by being a professional endurance athlete or living a lifestyle that's similar to that, you are setting yourself up for problems down the road. I like to say, okay, let's forget about that anecdote and actually just look at what the evidence suggests and really unpack what are the risks for that strategy and what are the benefits. So if we actually just take a look at the research that looks at professional endurance athletes, Olympic professional endurance athletes, we can start to kind of tease this out to some degree. And what we find when we look at that is if we compare those individuals to just the average person, they actually have quite a bit better life outcomes. So that could lead someone to think, okay, well, training like a professional endurance athlete is going to be a much better long-term outcome for me than doing whatever the average person is doing. And they would likely be right. But I think that's almost maybe a little too much surface level examination, because the counter to that is always going to be, well, the average person isn't all that healthy, so that's a pretty low bar if a professional endurance athlete's lifestyle can clear that. So then we maybe look at what are the middle grounds here. So let's say we took a person who's not focusing on peak performance, at least not exclusively, and they're willing to make some trade-offs that aren't going to get them potentially as good at a very specific discipline in order to have a more well-rounded lifestyle and potentially focus a little bit more primarily on health and longevity. In which case, I think you probably can make an argument that if you took a professional endurance athlete and compared them to someone who took the components of endurance training that have good evidence to longevity and health long-term and applied those, but removed a lot of the risks like peaking for a race, maybe pushing through an injury to get to a start line, and really kind of working everything around trying to perform at the highest level on a very specific day, yeah, that person likely could have a better long-term outlook or potential for that anyway than say that. So it really just depends on who we're going to compare these groups to. And I like to look at these things through like, well, what level of risk is involved in this versus that, and what are your goals and objectives? Like at the end of the day, I tend to look at life as something where I want to enjoy it along the way and I want to chase my passions. So there's a certain amount of risk I'm willing to take to be able to put myself in a position to feel like I can run my fastest 100-mile, even if that means that by doing something different, I could potentially be serving myself better down the road from just an overall health and longevity standpoint. Because otherwise you can quickly find yourself arguing your way into just living a life where you're avoiding every potential like fun, exciting thing in this effort to just live a couple of years longer, which, for some people that might be exciting and motivating, in which case, cool, go for it. But, for me and a lot of other people, I think it's more about, all right, what activities are going to bring more value and more excitement to the time we are here? And then at the end of the day, try to minimize long-term issues that could come up from that by paying attention. And like I was saying earlier, just like looking at these demanding lifestyles as something that actually probably means you have to pay closer attention versus less attention. So the other thing to think about here too, when we get into this topic, is when we look at things like the hyper high carb fueling side of things, we have a scenario here where it's possible that that sort of strategy is a feature that is going to be very selective. So what I mean by that is when we get to the level of someone like Lionel Sanders or an Olympic athlete, Tour de France cyclist or something like that, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to select for the person who can tolerate the demands that are going to, on paper, yield the best performance. So let's say, for example, we determine that the best way to win the Tour de France is to be able to tolerate 150 to 180 grams per hour. And we say, okay, well, our goal is to produce a winner of the Tour de France. So I want to work with a certain number of athletes to try to do that. If I know that the path to winning the Tour de France is 150 to 180 grams of carbohydrate per hour, and I also know that, let's say, 1 in 30 people are going to be able to tolerate that properly and find performance from it, or versus have like a negative consequence from that. It may be worth it in my mind to run that on all 30 of them just to produce that one who is going to be able to outcompete everybody else, because now I found the person who responds to that specific input and has the potential to tolerate it better than the rest. So we oftentimes will look at like pro athletes and things like that as these examples of what to do, when in reality it could just be a selection process where they can tolerate certain things much better than the average person. And if the average person applies that, they may have a negative consequence and not only have worse health outcomes down the road, but also maybe lose out on their specific potential in whatever pursuit they're doing from a sports standpoint as well. So, I mean, we see this selection type of thing all across the board with professional sports and things like that. It's not just nutrition. I think here's another example. Like we took like a cross country team and we determined, okay, here is a training program that is going to, on average, yield the fastest runner. And I have, say, 40 runners try out for this cross country team. If I know that this program is going to yield the fastest runner if done right, then if I apply to all 40 of them, and let's say that like I identify 5 to 7 out of that 40 who just respond really, really well to it, I'm probably going to run a faster team cross country race with those 5 to 7 who responded well to the program that on average is going to outperform other programs, even if a bunch of those other 40 end up not responding well to it. So you see that sort of kind of like selection to what could potentially yield the best oftentimes in sport. And that's where I think you get a big disconnect between maybe the average person and what we likely see on the podiums and things like the Olympics or professional sports and things like that too. So another thing to consider too here is just like age. So when we look at things like extreme carbohydrate usage or any input training too, a young athlete in their 20s, they may respond to dietary inputs like carbohydrates differently than, say, someone at the end of their career in their mid-30s, late 30s, early 40s or something like that. So what maybe they were able to get away with and work with in their 20s with success is no longer the same type of input that is going to work for them later in their career. And some of this may even just be like where they're at and what stages in terms of what their needs are from a training standpoint. Because you take a young professional who's just getting into the sport professionally, they likely still have a fairly extensive background of training just to get to that point. But they also have more potential growth inputs from different types of training stimulus versus, say, they're now 15 years later in that they've got 15 additional years of training that may change the inputs to some degree of what's going to yield the best result for them at that point in their career. Because at that point, they've likely already peaked, and now it's about maintaining it and potentially like strategizing in a way where they're going to outperform their competition through the tactics and things like that, versus for them doing training inputs that are going to get them to the next stage in their career, so to speak. So there's also like an age-related kind of question with that sort of thing too. So when we come back to just like nutrition side of this topic, I think there are some basic kind of considerations that I find useful. And the way I like to kind of start this is, first of all, if you're just getting into this, if you haven't said like, all right, I've been doing like this hyper high carbohydrate strategy and it's working great for me, I'm getting my blood tests, they're coming back great, all health markers are wonderful, more power to you. You can ignore anything I'm going to say going forward. Same thing if you're on the other side of that. If you're following a strict ketogenic diet and you're like, hey, this has been just a game changer for me, my health markers are great, my performance is great, what's the argument for me to change? Maybe there isn't one. If you're not one of those two extremes and you're like just kind of curious and thinking about, well, I want to learn, I want to try to figure out what I should be doing here, this is just what I would maybe say are worth considering here. Look at it through the lens of, think more about right fuel for the task you're going to be doing next. So if we kind of go back into the beginning where I talked about that variability in training for someone focusing on performance and how one day to the next might be different enough where you have to consider your dietary inputs. This is kind of what I'm getting at here, where if you take out your training calendar and say like, okay, what's coming up next? I think that can help guide you in terms of what type of fuel input is going to be useful for that, and put you in a position where you make the least amount of trade-offs in order to kind of reach your potential in that sort of training session. So if you're going in and you're looking at the calendar, you say, okay, I've got this hard workout on the schedule tomorrow. Regardless if you skew lower carb or higher carb, I think in that situation, you're going to want your meals to include a little more carbohydrate than you normally would have. So if you're like me and you're lower carb, that doesn't mean you employ Lionel Sanders' strategy of 1,000 plus grams of carbohydrate per day that day before. It means I'm coming off of baseline of what I would normally do. And, maybe instead of 100 grams of carbohydrate, I'm going to have 200 grams of carbohydrate or something like that day. And just kind of increase the carbohydrate to prepare myself for that harder training session the next day. And kind of the same thing, if someone's on a moderate carbohydrate diet, high carbohydrate diet, they might just want to look at that through the lens of, all right, let's look at this through a multi-day view, and I've got a hard training session come up, so I might skew a little more carbohydrate than I normally would for my meals leading into that next training session. Now, if we're looking at that training calendar and the next thing in line is, say, a long run or a high-end zone 2 training session, I think we want to look at this as, well, where are you at in training? So if you're at a part in training where you're doing, say, that long run or that high-end zone 2 workout, but you also have some speed work involved in that training week or that training block. In that scenario, I think you want to follow a similar strategy to what you did when you had that hard workout in there. You want to maybe think about, all right, I can't just be thinking about my fuel demands for this particular workout, but I also need to be planning for what's coming up next, and maybe include a little more carbohydrates above baseline with that type of a training session. Versus a scenario where, let's say you're in base training, you're doing very little speed work, maybe just some strides or hill bounds or something like that. In that scenario, I think that's an opportunity to keep your carbohydrates a little bit lower, regardless of whether your baseline is low carbohydrate or high carbohydrate, so that you're just leveraging the fact that, okay, I'm not going to be asking myself to do a ton of glycolytic work later in this week. I'm more or less rinsing and repeating low intensity volume here. Then I think you can probably do yourself a metabolic favor by being a little more strategic about how much of that higher octane carbohydrate fuel you end up using for a task that's going to require much less of it. And when you start kind of looking at the training program through that way, where it's like, okay, I found the dietary strategy that I generally like, and now it's just about kind of manipulating the ebb and flow of like the carbohydrate side of that thing throughout the training plan. I think when you're looking at it through that lens of, all right, what is the fuel that is going to be more dominant in this task? How much of it am I doing? And what's coming up next are generally going to be the better focus points than saying like, okay, I just need to throw carbohydrates in a super refined form at everything, or in the other side of things, I need to avoid every carbohydrate altogether because, I want to be a high fat burner or something like that. So those are my thoughts kind of on that specific topic and things like that. If you're interested, I actually did do a Substack post recently where I looked at kind of that question of, is endurance athletes unhealthy, or is that an unhealthy lifestyle? Should we be avoiding that sort of a training input? So if you want to kind of get another glance at kind of that and that study I referenced with the Olympic athletes, head over to my Substack, which is just zachbitter.substack.com. But also, if you have other topics or things you'd like me to hit on some of these solo episodes, feel free to shoot me a note either on socials, my website, zachbitter.com, or hpopodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for sticking around and listening to how I use the show sponsors. Maui Nui Venison is a product I discovered last year. What caught my eye was their quality and business model. They have paired the need to manage an invasive species with providing some of the most nutrient-dense meat you will find. The axis deer arrived in Maui in single digits but grew fast and have damaged the local ecosystem, and if left unchecked, are projected to reach up to 200,000 in number in future years. Maui Nui decided to solve this problem and minimize waste. Axis steer meat provides 43% of your daily value of protein in just 107 calories and boasts a 1.5 to 1 omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which is the most balanced ratio of any red meat. This same 107 calories provides 22% of your daily value of vitamins and 37% of your daily value of minerals. They have a wide range of products including ground venison, leg medallions, rib chops, strip loin, loin fillets, and loin chops. They also make a beef stick that includes an option with organ meats, which makes a perfect protein-packed snack that I will usually have in the afternoon before a strength session. I've also been enjoying the ground venison for dinner, usually paired with steamed vegetables or a sweet potato. You can find a bunch of recipes and ways to prepare their products on their website at mauinuivenison.com. Element Electrolytes is my go-to electrolyte supplement. Based on my electrolyte loss rate of 614 milligrams per liter, I begin my day with half a packet of one of their hot beverage flavors with my morning coffee. I rotate through all of them, but my favorite at the moment is the chocolate mint. Later in the day, I have been having either a packet of their watermelon flavor or a can of Element Sparkling, which is their carbonated electrolyte drink. I usually have the black cherry lime or watermelon flavor for those. If you are curious about how to dial in your own fluid and electrolyte setup, check out episode 300 of this podcast, where I dive into some of the things you can do at home to gauge how much fluid and electrolytes you may need. A free sample pack with your first purchase can be found at drinklmnt.com/HPO. Delta G ketones is the best researched exogenous ketone supplement on the market. The research on exogenous ketones is constantly evolving. Delta G is responsible for much of it, hosting 50-plus published studies and 20-plus ongoing studies, and have received DARPA grants designed for special forces. Delta G uses ketone esters, which is unmatched in raising blood ketone levels when matched per gram. The best use case, as the evidence currently stands, is as a post-workout supplement for better recovery and or during longer, lower intensity sessions to help with mental focus. For this reason, I will have a bottle of Delta G Performance, that's the little blue bottle, after my biggest workouts for the week and during long run training sessions once I have been out running for about 45 to 60 minutes. Head over to deltagketones.com and enter BITTER20 for 20% off your next purchase. Curranz, which is spelled Curranz, is a pre-workout supplement that I started using this year based on the evidence that it can help improve blood flow, allowing for improved muscle oxygenation, which can potentially enhance endurance performance. It also can increase fat oxidation, reduce muscle damage, and delay fatigue. Black currants are rich in anthocyanins, a type of antioxidants which may contribute to their health benefits. The research suggests benefits can be seen after a week of usage pre-exercise. I take 2 capsules of currants before each morning training session. During longer races, I will be taking an extra 2 capsules every 4 hours. Currants has been used for lots of the research on black currants, so be sure to head over to curranzusa.com, that's CURRANZUSA.com, to check them out and the latest studies. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.